Hi, JL. Welcome to the Buy, Grow, Sell podcast.
Hi there.
Appreciate you making the time to come on the show.
My pleasure.
Joe, you're one of those interesting entrepreneurs that I get a chance to speak to. That I guess has been involved in what we sort of call the entire buy, grow, sell cycle, which I find is fascinating. A lot of our guests on the show they've been involved in a business and perhaps exited, and that tends to be a good focus for discussion. But every now and again we come across guests who have often started a company, gone through this big growth cycle, sold, and then got back into the cycle via buying other businesses or doing more startups. So I understand that that's been your journey. So yeah, looking forward to unpacking that a little bit today. I also know, just as a bit of guidance for listeners, there's a good focus here around online businesses, which, really, I think for listeners out there, if you're not looking at ways to be online and take your business online, then you're probably missing out. But, it's going to be a good theme for our discussion today. But perhaps just for the audience, maybe you could kick off and just give us a little bit of your background and kind of what led you to your, the first business I think we're going to cover off, which is Valence.
Sure, yeah. I've been in what one could call consumer tech, which includes e-commerce, for over 20 years now. And that would explain why I've seen a number of things. I've just been around long enough to see the evolution of the web as distribution, as marketing platform, and also interact directly with the big tech titans that shape that platform that we all operate on. And so I've been part of a early stage tech startup based in Silicon Valley that did well, then not well, had to pivot, and I was part of that process with VC investors behind it and all. That was early in my career, so I was less involved in the M&A side of it. I've built a business or two or three from the ground up. I've also merged businesses and seen what that dynamic is about. And then indeed, 3 years ago, I was involved in selling a business that I helped build from the ground up to a private equity-backed company, high-stakes transaction, very stressful, complicated. And then more recently, I've been in the acquisitions game, specifically the buy then build approach, where you buy a mature or growing business rather than start from the ground up. So I've seen kind of all dimensions, and I enjoy working on them. But I'm really passionate now about that. Buying then building an existing business.
Yeah, that's cool. I find the whole question of buy versus build to be really fascinating. We talk a lot on this show about growth via acquisition and why that's a solid alternative to just organic growth. But I'm sure we'll perhaps unpack that in a little bit. But I understand your background. You spent some time working at Google.
Yeah, so I worked, like I said at the outset there, for a tech startup that was very early in the web. 99, I think they started. That is 1999. They were taking PDF files and putting them on the web as kind of proto ebooks, and it was backed by the inventor of the PDF file format, John Warnock, who founded Adobe Systems, one of today's most valuable tech companies. And so we were involved in that. And in that context, I got a certain know-how, which is how to persuade a book publisher to trust putting their content on the web. 2-3 years later, after I had worked in other settings, Google came knocking. I didn't know what actually wanted me to do. They were unclear at first, but it was in fact to help with their initiative that's now many years mature to persuade publishers and libraries to put books on Google services. So yeah, that's how I got involved in that.
Yeah, fascinating. It's I guess it's as a place to also learn and further your knowledge. I guess Google's a great place to help you take that next step. So moving on, though, you obviously went into Valence. Could you give us a little bit of background? Well, what was the company? What did they do? How did you get that started?
Yeah, let me connect some dots there. So I went to work for Google to work on their book-related initiative, and for just over 9 years, I found myself in seemingly every industry segment, persuading a content party or content provider to trust Google with putting their content in Google services. So we're talking Google Maps, various health initiatives. I ran content and strategy for Google Finance for some years, um, elections, public sector information. And in that setting, I got pulled into a project for Google Shopping, so the e-commerce side of what Google's involved with still today. And as part of my research, I learned about what was then a nascent program that we now in e-commerce know quite well as FBA. So the Fulfill by Amazon program, I saw a webinar with the original product manager for the program, presented it, and I thought, okay, this is going to change things. And my instinct was grounded in the fact that I grew up in a family that does retail. We've been in the business for generations as a family, and so I could sense how much it would simplify, facilitate building an e-commerce business to have all of that warehouse stuff, all of that fulfillment and customer service around it taken care of. And so from that point, I actually started a side hustle while at Google and ran it for a few years, which, as I would say, a best practice with launching your first venture. Don't quit your day job, as I'm sure your listeners have heard. Stay as long as you can before you then have to run on your own income. So anyway, I built that side hustle, and that led to another venture and another. I could make a list of about a dozen I've launched within the Amazon ecosystem. But one of them that I started with a group of grad students that I indirectly hired to help me both choose a business to launch. I gave them 3 ideas to validate and explore, and we chose one. And then I hired one of them ongoing to help us build the business. And we did. And this business model wasn't original. We were not the first to come up with this, but it's basically auditing Amazon, examining the data that Amazon provides on its Fulfilled by Amazon or FBA program to catch errors and then make claims with Amazon for the money back. And then this business, Valence, would collect a share of that money, that reimbursement from Amazon. Again, we weren't the first to do it, but we came at it in a distinct way. We said we saw that there was a segment of Amazon sellers that were going to get bigger faster over time, which are brands versus retailers. And so we centered on that group of Amazon sellers. And sure enough, they were kind of the emerging segment there. And within 3 years, gosh, even less than that, 2.5 years or so of launching the business, a private equity backed player in an adjacent industry approached us. And we knew from the second they arrived, we got their overture through LinkedIn, that this was going to be an interesting opportunity. And we went through the process of selling them the business. Again, because we'd chosen a kind of a different approach to that business model that was appealing to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned you weren't the first to offer this service. So I'm curious, when private equity came along and they were talking to you about discussions, what was it that they saw about your business versus perhaps others in your space?
Yeah, so the PE firm behind the actual acquiring company has investments in e-commerce. I won't name names, but they own several major services in the Shopify and Amazon ecosystems, and so they know their stuff. Like they understand trends, and they too understood that. And this is still a kind of a developing trend, that brands are cutting out the middleman, setting aside their retail relationships and selling directly on Amazon through Shopify or our other platform to sell direct to consumer on a website. And so they saw that we were doing that we had hundreds of clients and that they were of that profile. They probably also saw that we were young and our revenue was limited and they could probably buy us for a song. And for us, it ended up being a great number and transaction. For them, it was small. It was
Yes.
I think, it was probably the smaller sort of deal that they would do.
I think that's an interesting point for people listening, and thinking that they may want to sell one day, is that, when you've got a business, I guess, like yours that is built around data and can be obviously scaled, before it gets too big. I mean, obviously PE can bring the capital to scale you, right, if you've got a working model. And so I guess there's somewhere in there is the kind of gray area that makes sense for a good deal. So can you give us an idea of roughly what the business was turning over in terms of top line revenue when you went through the transaction?
Sure. Yeah, if I can remember, it's actually a little hard to pull it together in my head here. So we had some hundreds of clients. We were winning 2 or 3 a week at that point, and each client was worth about $3,000-4,000 a year for us in revenue. So you can do the math on that. We were probably running around $1 million in service revenue, which is quite different than retail revenue. It's more valuable. And it was a relatively efficient business. We had some manual activity, but it was on software driven. And so pretty good gross margin. Yeah, that was the scale.
Nice.
But I have to stress, like, just how small a team had pulled this together and how I wasn't actually that involved. This was like a classic, no, not classic. It was a reversal of the usual scenario. Usually the founder entrepreneur is working in their business, not on their business. I was actually working on the business the entire time, meaning I was not part of the operations. I was always just helping set strategy with the occasional client, going for capital when it was needed. And so I'm quite proud of it, but also kind of ashamed because I've built other businesses that I worked deeply in and spent hours on, and they've never achieved the kind of enterprise value this business did. And so there's maybe a lesson in that about if you're having to work it too hard, maybe you're not doing the right thing as a founder entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's a great tip. It's funny. We talk a lot to our clients about thinking about exit planning and stuff like that. Not because they necessarily want to get out now, but hey, what do you want to achieve out of this journey or out of the experience with this particular asset? And one of the big questions we're always asking is, well, what do you want to be doing with your time? And how long do you want to keep doing what you're doing? And I think to your point, I mean, I think we've all seen business owners out there doing sort of 60, 80 hours a week, grinding it out. And if you're not getting the results to sort of compensate you for that, well, yeah, I guess at some point you start to burn out and have to ask some pretty serious questions of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly that period of launching and building a business where you do have to put in that effort and where you have to keep your head down and accept, failure after failure and keep going. That's for sure. So if I have an observation there that's meaningful, it's that if you've gone kind of a reasonable journey there and it's not yet, showing light, then there is reason to ask the question. So there's a balance to strike there. But anyway, the overall point is this was an uncommon experience for me in my career where limited effort, high return. There's a lesson in that, I think, for some of your listeners who may have unique skill, limited time. If they can just find the right team, set them in motion, keep them going, stand back, that they might actually get an interesting outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great tip. Appreciate you sharing that. Out of interest, when you did sell, and obviously without going into anything that might be overly confidential here, but I'm curious how they came up with the valuation. I mean, if you can share the number, great. But if not, what kind of formula did they use? Typically we see multiples of EBITDA or top line revenue or whatever it might be. Yeah. But I'm just curious how they came up with whatever the number was.
Yeah, we definitely shaped their calculation and did that by providing either 2 or 3 years of projected top line and bottom line, because the trending bottom line wasn't that interesting from a multiple perspective. I mean, even if it was like 20x EBITDA, it wouldn't have, I think, been that interesting for us. We're interested in selling at that level, and they knew that. So we centered it right. I think, we centered it around like a 1 to 2 year kind of milestone in the future and what that would look like, and then a multiple of that. That said, when the offer was coming, and it seemed to take forever for that term sheet to arrive with the actual number, I was at the moment it arrived. It was an important moment I'll never forget. I was up in the Smoky Mountains in the eastern United States on vacation with my kids when it came in, and I thought it could be anywhere from X to Y. Like, it was such a wide range, and it landed about the middle. So I was happy in the end. But in our case, it was not based on a strict kind of EBITDA times X. It was some projection in the future times that.
Well, and I think that's a really good point for listeners as well, is that, buyers aren't buying your past, they're buying your future. And so how can you shape that story? I'd like to ask you about deal structure and risk management in a moment, but I think with your business, there's no question about that trend increasing in terms of more users on Amazon, more sellers, more buyers, more transactions, therefore most likely more errors and a growing market for your business. So that growth story I certainly see in any of the transactions we've run that growth story is critical for buyers because they don't want to keep doing what you're doing. They want to grow and get a big return on their investment. So I can certainly see why that would have played out and been important in your case. I'm curious though, but with a number or a valuation that's based on kind of these future projections, did you guys have some kind of component of earnout or something like that to help the buyers mitigate some of their
We did.
risk?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
More than half of the consideration was tied to an earnout, and that was part of a further chapter in the story. One thing I'm reflecting on, remembering about the whole transaction that's notable is how there were several factors that were definitely not tied to the EBITDA, definitely not tied to the bottom line or even the growth potential that attracted them to us. One was simply being connected to the Amazon ecosystem. This acquiring party had a sizable business that was involved with two other platforms, or kind of major players in logistics. And for them to add Amazon to their set of services, just to have that brand name. This was in 2019 when Amazon was very ascendant, as they are today, and as they certainly were during the pandemic. But at that time, it just was quite sexy to be attached to Amazon in the logistics space. And so they were buying access. And I point that out because your listeners, there's a concept in Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, a great book on entrepreneurship, of unfair advantages. Every entrepreneur, every business has certain unfair advantages over competition. They have certain unique connections, traits, whatever. We had that. And we recognized their interest there. When I figured that out, we played it. Like, we would remind them all the time about that growth rate of Amazon's ecosystem. 20% a year in the marketplace has been the trend for 15 years. And so anyway, we had that trait. And this is going to sound a bit self-involved, but I think that the CEO really liked me. Like, he wanted me in his circle. He liked the way I talked. He liked my background in consumer tech with Google, Adobe, Amazon. And so I did my best. I was kind of nudged by my partner, Meredith. She could tell that was the fact. Like, she actually met him too. We had a visit to their offices. And so I kind of made a point of just being his friend and like being very, very kind of engaged with him. And so there again, I would urge others looking to do a deal to like look for those soft edges in the transaction and work them, because they can, if not push up the valuation, they can solidify the probability of a close.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it did get dicey for our deal, as for any deal. Like, there were points when things got uncertain. We missed our numbers at one point as we were moving through diligence, and that caused a lot of concern. And so those other connections, I think, held the deal together.
That's a great insight. I mean, it just goes to show that there's no silver bullet with anything, right? And there's no one thing that's going to, I guess, necessarily decide the outcome. So, yeah, really, really interesting. I think, time and time again, I see in deals that transactions actually only happen when willing buyer and willing seller come together and are able to form a lot of trust and a good relationship in a very short period of time. And it sounds like you really obviously had that mix. Because there's nothing worse than in a deal and having your numbers have a little dip or a little, it throws everybody into chaos, causes a bit of panic. And I guess then your job as a seller is to convince them that this is not a long-term issue, it's a short-term blip, and you got all those sort of conversations which can be quite challenging to have. So, and speaking of due diligence and I guess the process in general, can you talk to me a little bit about what that process looked like? Did the buyer find you? Did you find them? What did the exit discussion sound like with yourself and the people you were working with? And then I'd like to touch a little bit on how long the process took and what that looked like.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that we knew instantly when we got the overture. It came through a LinkedIn message from someone at the PE firm behind the acquiring party that this was a high potential connection. And we knew that because we'd actually already researched who might buy our business. And they were atop the list. They were actually the number one candidate in their particular segment. We just liked a lot of the energy we saw looking at their business. And I'd actually spoken to a couple of their people at like trade shows just to get aware of how they think.
That's really cool.
Anyway, that's
Can
how
I jump in
the
and ask
connection
you?
was made.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry to speak over you. I was hoping to jump in and ask a quick question on that because you mentioned that you'd already had a discussion around potential acquirers. So was that? Can I ask who were the key people in your business? Was it a small enough business that you were talking to everybody about this? Was it just one other close partner? I'm kind of curious about the mindset of a business owner. Going from kind of
Yeah.
growth mode to talking exit.
So I'll preface by saying it can be very hazardous, I think, for a business to be too obsessed with exiting, like for the word exit to be spoken more than a few times a week. We'll just stipulate
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
So I've seen that actually be a hazard in other businesses because you're anticipating your beautiful future before you've actually earned it if you do it too much. Anyway, the GM of the business, one of those grad students that I involved in first validating which business model to pursue, he and I were engaged in that discussion from day one, and we stayed in it. And that's partly because the program where I got the access to these grad students was an entrepreneurship program at a university, and where they're effectively trained, to build startups and eventually exit them. So it's just part of the cycle, the business cycle mentality that this colleague Jason came with. And so we were thinking about it and interviewing directly or indirectly would be buyers throughout our 2.5 year build of the business. And so when that overture came in, we were not only able to recognize it as high potential, but also we moved. Like we got in position as fast as we could for the transaction, which takes us into the kind of the diligence process question. So that ran for, I don't know, a month, and it was thorough. It was very probing. The CFO of the acquiring company had a background in M&A, and he knew his game. And the CEO had come from a very large business that had many acquisitions in the financial services sector. So just rigorous questions left and right. The hardest part of the diligence process, I think, though, was the redlining of the legal agreements. That's just part of the overall process for any deal. But there was a struggle with their responsiveness, and it kind of wore us down. And our legal counsel was quite expensive, and so we were anxious about going through the whole process, having a 5-figure legal bill, and then not having a deal. Like if the deal didn't happen, it was going to be very painful to us to have to swallow that. And so I point out to your listeners who are envisioning a sale and who are running already, barely, on fumes as a business, you need to make sure you've got a bit of a budget to do an M&A event, because if it doesn't happen, it's going to be a expensive detour.
yeah. It's a very important point. We've had a number of clients in the SaaS space, and tech and even e-com. And I'm curious on your perspective. You said DD went for about a month, which by a lot of accounts is actually pretty quick.
Yeah.
What was the technical DD like? What was that experience like? And one of the big questions we always get is from clients is they're concerned about technical DD because they're saying, well, if we open up and show them everything, aren't we at risk of giving away our kind of 11 herbs and spices? How do you manage the need to open up and do due diligence to get the deal done with confidentiality?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I'm actually remembering now that there was the business diligence around the numbers, projections, and the kind of details of how the client service was delivered. And then there was the diligence around the tech. And our tech had been built by a brother of mine, also on a very part-time basis. He's quite capable, but anyway, it made it so there was a little tenuousness around. And then we had a couple of engineers on staff. We had 3 at that point. There too, I think there was a personality driven approach. We had my brother and the engineers visit. We had, I think, a couple of different meetings, one in Salt Lake City where the business was based, and the other in Kansas City, middle of the US, where the acquiring party is based. And again, I think it was just like having people interact. Lots of questions that were answered in writing, but it was mostly just like people talking. I remember seeing their tech leads and ours come out of a meeting, and they're all just sort of chummy and shaking hands and comfortable with each other's personality, I guess. Like that seemed to make a bigger difference than the hard facts about the tech.
Yep.
So yeah, that's the insight I have. I was actually a little less involved in the particulars of it, but we were. I know this. There were a lot of questions around risk for the acquiring party of any code being, an infringement on another party's code, and that we had to do some scrutiny around that. So anyway.
Yep. Yeah, cool. It's interesting. It's such a fine line to walk, and I hear your point that some of this does come down to the relationships and an element of trust. We've seen some other mechanisms that we've helped put in place too. That there's different ways to do the DD reviews. Sometimes it's been an agreed third party come in. Sometimes we have quarantined part of the code that can only be released on signing a deal and stuff like that. So I think a lot of DD2 is people just kind of at least getting enough of a check of the tech that they know that it's not built on something that's completely outdated or something that they know they need to rebuild from day one. So, I think as people take each progressive step through the process, those parties, those relationships you've talked about, people get more confidence too, right? And they're more able to sort of get their head around what the risk actually looks like or how they might be able to minimize it. So, but it is interesting. And I think from a listener's perspective, if you've got tech in your business, there's no one formula or one approach to how you would handle a due diligence in this. It's, every business is different. Every scenario is different. Every buyer is different. And so like everything, it's about negotiation and discussions and trying to work out the right approach for everybody involved. Otherwise, deals just die anyway. So yeah.
Here's one thing I'll add to that discussion. That's probably the more useful perspective I would offer, and that is ideas for a business to build, a product to develop. They're easy. Any idea you can get or generate, someone else has already had, and maybe 15 people have had. And I'm espousing here conventional wisdom. It's execution that makes a difference. It's whether you can actually make something happen, get from 0 to 1. I think the same applies to software. Unless you're delivering something that is absolutely distinctive, it's not how the code is written and what's in the code. It's the fact that a code works. And a competitor can't just look at your code and then replicate it working. They can replicate some of the logic of it, but I would worry less in that setting, unless I had a absolutely distinctive business, but then I'd have patents on it. So I think that fear of exposure to an acquirer, unless they're visibly craven and just trying to take advantage, I think you should just trust fall and let them see it all and know that if you got it working, you're already way ahead of anyone trying to copy you because you got it working.
Yeah. That makes sense. So just to I guess wrap up Valence. I mean, from the time you got that first LinkedIn message, you said there was something about a month in due diligence, but obviously there's always discussions, negotiations, contracts being written. Just roughly from memory, I mean, what would have been the period of time from when you first got the LinkedIn message to when the deal had closed?
Yeah, about 3 months. It was June that we were contacted, and it was September that we closed. And there was relatively active, intense communication the entire time. There wasn't really any lulls of note. There were some days when we were waiting anxiously for a response and worrying maybe they had changed their minds, and that wore that wore me down. But that's just because I was kind of a first timer at that scale of a deal. I've done other deals, but not at this scale for me. So about 3 months.
No, that's cool. That's interesting. And I also, I think it's another good point that you've just made, that three months in my world or my perspective is relatively quick. I think tech enables that a little bit more in tech businesses, but that's a relatively quick period of time. And still there were some frustrations, perhaps emotional ups and downs, that you've referred to there. So, I think for business owners listening to this, it's, you've got to be able to stay calm through this, manage yourself, no answer for a few days or a bit of silence doesn't mean no interest. There's all these little things I think that set us off. The human being behind the business can get can sort of get thrown off by different things. And so, a little bit of patience and managing yourself through that process is going to be one of the most important things. And of course, if you are very operational in your business, keep focused on your company, right? Keep focused on getting the numbers in the door and keeping the performance in the direction it's meant to go. And hopefully you've got good people around you helping manage the deal, so it's taking the workload of that off your plate.
Yeah, in fact, I'll point out that to do a deal of a certain scale, you obviously need a law firm and maybe an accounting firm. You absolutely have to have your tax strategy around that. But what you also need, it's an odd phrasing, but you need a deal doula. So a doula is, I'm not sure if in Australia you have this term to describe, typically it's a female who advises a woman who's about to give birth.
Right.
Or advises, who's like helps kind of shape the experience and helps take the rough edges off and advocates with the physicians and all the rest. And I had that in my partner Meredith, I mentioned earlier, and that was largely because she's a professor of she teaches negotiation at a university level, has for years, and so she understands the kind of the inner game of the deal, and she counseled me through those difficult moments and kept me more self-aware and like higher emotional intelligence than I would have had otherwise. And so those listening, who are considering a deal, be sure that you have not only a great lawyer and a great accountant, but a great advisor, kind of confidant who understands you and your soul and can help you work through it, because the deal will push you to an edge for sure.
Yeah. Look, great advice. JL, perhaps we can shift gear here, because you've done a successful transaction. I think for a lot of people, it's put aside the financial side of it. Usually, going through a deal like that is life changing, because it changes their perspective on so many things. But you've taken that experience of being on one side of the fence, and then basically now you've become also a buyer of businesses. Really curious about what sort of a mindset shift has taken place. How has your previous experiences sort of influenced that?
Yeah, well, I really enjoy it. And I particularly enjoy looking at a mature business that has some distress to it or some difficulty and needs what the team I've built can bring. This is in the consumer product space. So we buy brands that are 2 years to 20 years old. Actually, the oldest one we acquired was 70 years mature. Wow. And so in that context, what I've come to really appreciate about a potential seller of a business is brutal transparency, or that's not the way to phrase it, just an ability to be frank about what's not working in the business. Like typically we're coming in because there's an issue. And we need to know not only about the issue, but the systemic issues that cause that issue. And I actually just had an email exchange with a would-be seller rather, of a business that's only 3 years old. It's doing $500,000 in revenue, pretty solid bottom line, but they have challenges or they have threats to the business. And I really appreciated how transparently this young entrepreneur, it's like 21, so he's kind of built something very, very early in his career, how well he addressed the questions. And I had to kind of pose the right questions to get that out of him. But he did. He told me, in effect, if I were to continue, these are 3 things I'd be most concerned with. And these are the 4 things I would do in ranked order. And it gave me such a clear vision. And so from my side of the table that I sit on now, I really appreciate that kind of transparency that some bring. And I notice that when others don't. And it definitely either slows down the process or it turns us off as a buyer for sure.
Yeah, that's a really great insight, because I'm always saying to our clients, nobody has a perfect business. Everybody has issues in their business or things that they could improve. So don't go into a transaction. But buyers, particularly buyers who've done it a few times, don't actually expect you to have a perfect business. So and here is the transparency issue, right? I'm always saying to them, people expect you to have issues in your business. The important thing is putting them on the table and demonstrating that you've actually thought about them, that you actually, have, if you haven't already implemented a solution or you're implementing a solution, that you actually have ideas around what that solution might look like. There's been some intelligent thought behind it. I said that in my book is what buyers are always looking for, which you've very much just confirmed. So I just can't stress enough too that point of transparency. Just being open and honest about where you think things can go and what you think might be the milestones or hurdles. So yeah, that's fascinating. And all the businesses you're buying, they're all around this retail space, I understand?
Yeah, they either have primarily wholesale revenue, so they're a traditional brand that works with retailers to go to market, or they are that and they have online revenue, Amazon Marketplace, or they run a website such as on the Shopify platform. And
Yeah, cool.
we favor a certain mix, a certain profile, but we're open to various things. I think we're actually ultimately more interested in the strength of the brand and the strength of the product line. We'll figure out the sales channel optimization and the reallocation of revenue from here to there if the brand is strong, or if the products are solid. They lead in their category, even if they're maybe overdue for a refresh.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can I ask how many acquisitions you've done now?
Yeah, we've acquired 5 in the last year to 2, and we intend to bring on a number, 2 to 4 in the next calendar year. We're about to go on a buying spree, in part because economic times are suggesting that there's clouds on the horizon, and so we're definitely seeing sellers more interested in selling and also a little more flexible on sales price. And that actually is something I've been ruminating on, that I think I could offer an unfinished perspective onto your audience here. And that is, when you take a business to market, in this case, a consumer product brand, but it would also apply to a SaaS type business, do you name the price explicitly, or do you provide the hard facts and let it be the buyer's decision what they're to propose? And frankly, I'm not sure what I prefer. Like it's clarifying when a seller does indicate their price, and it helps kind of get everything in focus quickly. But then I've encountered now plenty of buyers whose idea of their business's value is way off, and it in effect tells me, all right, go ahead and back off, let them spend 6 months failing to sell, and then engage. Whereas if they just said, here are facts, what do you propose? What's your offer? I think that would probably be more constructive, especially where the business has, again, some substantial amount of distress. If you're building a business that actually has problems but not distress, that's a different story. But if you have that squishiness inside the business, I think it's better to not say, here's our valuation. We think we're worth this amount. No, state all the facts and let the conversation build from there.
Another wonderful insight, JL. Thank you. It is another one of those pivotal questions that I certainly have from people wanting to sell. How do we actually present into the market? And you've absolutely nailed the two sort of versions there. I think a lot of people even come to us at Exit Advisory to say, we're thinking of selling. What do you think it's worth? And they all have a number in their head of what they think it's worth. But there's, what one of our previous guests, Greg Alexander, was saying. He said, I always think there's 2 numbers. There's your number in your head of what you think it's worth or what it's worth to you, and there's the number of what it's worth to the market. And he said, he was saying, in my perspective, if the market values your business more than you do, sell it. Because that opportunity may reverse sometime in the future, and you may never get that opportunity again. But getting clarity on those perspectives, I think, is pretty important to determine whether you go down the path of running a process and investing money in that, et cetera, et cetera. I certainly think, from my perspective, even as helping a lot of sellers over the years, I do think presenting the facts and asking the market, what do you think, is a good way to go. Of course, everything is negotiable after that, but it's you can always say, hey, you think it's worth 2 million? Well, look, we think it's worth 3 million, and here's why. Let's give you some insight on why we think that's the case, and it becomes more of a discussion then, doesn't it? It's just everyone can present their sides, and typically, I guess you land somewhere in the middle. But it's such an interesting part of the equation.
It is, and just to demonstrate how I'm playing in every dimension, I'm actually actively preparing to sell a business on our roster right now. It's time, we think, for it to go to a next stage owner, and so our approach is to not name the price, but rather to focus on the fundamentals and to ensure that the offer goes to as many prospective buyers as possible, and give everyone a certain amount of time, but then a deadline to react. And in that way, we're hopeful that we'll have, ideally, kind of a range of offers that will demonstrate to us what the market thinks. I know what we have our idea, but the market, like you said, it knows what the value is, collectively. If you get enough offers, you have to have that kind of, indexing going on with, multiple parties. So that's how we're approaching the scenario, because the business is actually strong. It has, some areas for development, but it's not fundamentally distressed in any way.
Yeah, yeah, that's and some more great insights, about running a proper process and having enough people at least in the mix is, I think, a great tip. I'm curious about your strategy here. Once again, don't want to ask for the 11 herbs and spices here, but it's in my head when you're talking about acquisitions. I was wondering, are you acquiring various brands to build a larger sort of conglomerate, or do you see the acquisitions you make as just independent brands that may be spun out again later? And do you have a broader appeal, or is it just a sort of case by case basis?
Yeah, we think of ourselves as a stage 2 business owner, and by implication, there's a stage 3 that we come in when a business is in need of new ownership and a redirection, and where the owners don't have the answers, they don't have the playbook. We do. We bring it, we play it for 2, 3, 4 years. This is our vision. We're not yet mature enough to have had exits, and then we hand it off. And so this is the brand I referred to as the first acquisition, and we think it's time. And it's time in this respect. We've decided not to do internationalization. We don't do international expansion. We'd like to.
Okay.
It's an interesting kind of business to run. I actually was based in France and the UK for Google for a while, so I know what it's like to run or to operate internationally. But that's not in our charter. And therefore, if this business is to properly grow, it has to get into the hands of a party that can operate globally. And so that's how we've decided it's time. So we're kind of in the house flipping business, you could say. We take on a business when it needs to be renovated, and then we hand it off to a buyer that really will appreciate it and care for it as a stage 3 owner.
Yeah, interesting. It's I think for those listening and wondering who might be the right buyer for their business, I think you've sort of touched on here what we would use the Ansoff matrix for. You're thinking about a buyer, and if you haven't listening and you're not sure what the Ansoff matrix is, shoot us a message. We can share information. Google it. There's so much out there, but typically there's businesses out there doing the same products and services in the same market. That's just a no-brainer for them. You're basically a competitor, or are they doing similar products and services in a different market, or are they in the same market as you but with different products and services? Where's the mix, or where's the reason why they might want to buy you? And we've got a couple of deals on at the moment where there's associated industry or companies, like if one might be in, I don't want to give it away. I'll just say I'll use a different industry completely. Allied health. You run medical centers, but you don't do physiotherapy and all that sort of stuff. If you're in the same market, maybe you want to branch into those new services. But if you're in another country and you're not in those services as well, it's just too much of a leap, right? New markets and new services. So I think some of the people I've met out there get a little bit excited around how much their business might be an opportunity for an international buyer. And it's like, yes, in some ways, but in a lot of cases, it's just a stretch too far. And so I think having a bit of thought go into that kind of strategy before you start thinking of selling is going to be important to come up with the right sort of list of buyers. So yeah, that's great. JL, this has been a great discussion. I mean, you've shared so many insights and so many really critical tips here for business owners. I'm and a little bit cognizant of time, but are you happy for people to reach out to you? You mentioned that other business you're selling wasn't doing international, but do you look at buying other businesses that are run by, like, for example, if there was people in Australia who are running an Amazon online business and wanted to sell, like, is that of interest to you because it's on an online platform, or what's the kind of approach there for you?
Let's see. We've looked at buying a business based in the UK, but that has substantial US operations, and we pulled away because the party had a outrageously wrong idea of their business's value, not because of the kind of international dimension of it. And so the answer is, I think we would certainly entertain, but it'd be a case where the business has a U.S. presence, or it has existing distribution and it's working, and
Yes.
Where we could be the ones to take charge of that. And
Yeah.
we're actually contemplating joint venture scenarios too. We're looking at an acquisition for which kind of randomly the product is popular in the U.S. and it has high potential in Northern Europe, of all places. It has to do with genetics, and we don't
Yep.
want to, as you heard, do internationalization. But if we could find a JV partner in Northern Europe, we'd love that. Like, that'd be so cool to do. So I would definitely welcome inquiries from parties outside the U.S. if there's a connection with this market where we have strength and know-how and a team of 20 people across the U.S. we can execute. But and I'll just underscore, maybe we'll change our minds next year and we'll start going global. But what I'm trying to illustrate there is one principle of business, which is, know the scope, know your charter, and stay within it. And if you change it, be thoughtful about it. Like, you're actually writing it down, like, we are now doing X, but we're not doing that. I just think it's really important to do that. And I say that as an entrepreneur that's launched a dozen businesses that at different times had charter creep, didn't hang on to the original vision too tightly enough.
Yeah, that's some more great advice there, though. So thank you. So I've got, obviously, you're on LinkedIn. I mean, are you happy for people to reach out to you on that platform, or is there a better way that people can contact you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great.
Awesome. Okay. Well, as we always say on the show, if you do reach out to JL, please put a little note in there when you're sort of reaching out, to let him know maybe that you've heard him on this podcast, so he has a little bit of context as to why you're reaching out. But look, JL, thank you. You've been not just a nugget of gold. You've given numerous gold tips and insights here. It's been fabulous having you on the show, and really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, Simon. Wish you well.
Awesome. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in for another episode. We will put some show notes in there with JL's LinkedIn profile. And of course, there's some other connections there to other businesses he's running at the moment. So by all means, check him out. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us as well. We'll do what we can to help you. And hopefully we'll see you and hear from you for the next episode.